Becoming a happier person requires effort. It's an achievement, not a gift of the gods, wrote Bertrand Russell in his very famous book, The Conquest of Happiness. This is the fourth in a series of programs I'm doing on Bertrand Russell's book. You recall in past programs I pointed out that Russell was a very famous 20th century philosopher and mathematician. Early on in his book, Russell points out that his youth was a very unhappy one. Indeed, he says that he often thought about committing suicide, but what kept him going was his interest in mathematics. He says, though, that around the time of middle age, he began to learn how to become a happier person, and that by the time he was in his early 50s, he had become significantly happier. He lived to his 90s, by the way. And in this book, he indicates that one of his reasons for writing The Conquest of Happiness was to share some of the ideas he had learned about living a more fulfilling life. With regard to the structure of the book, the first half of the book is entitled Causes of Unhappiness, and each chapter is on a different cause of what Russell considers to be unhappiness. In the second half of the book, he talks about causes of happiness, and again, each chapter is about a different major cause of happiness as Russell sees it. I mentioned last week that Russell's definition of happiness is that it's a feeling of contentment and peace of mind. I also mentioned that Russell is something of an optimist when it comes to happiness, and his views compared with those of some other famous thinkers. I pointed out, for example, that Sigmund Freud was not optimistic about our chances for becoming very happy, although he said we should try. I also mentioned that St. Augustine, one of the most famous Catholic philosophers, said that we could not hope for much happiness in this life, that happiness is reserved for those who achieve salvation, for those who go to heaven. And I mentioned also that Mother Teresa said that suffering will never be completely absent from our lives. I think Russell would agree with Mother Teresa, but would add that he believed that we can significantly increase the number of happy moments we experience and decrease the number of unhappy moments which we experience. Allow me a brief review of some of the causes of happiness I've already spoken about in past programs. Russell talks about zest being an important cause of happiness. His first chapter on happiness is entitled Zest. And what does he mean by that? Well, zest is something that gives a pleasant taste or relish. It's something that gives a pleasant flavor to life. In other words, it's a reliable source of enjoyment. And what are examples of things that can give zest? Well, for many Americans, watching sports, playing sports, can provide that zest. For other people, it might be reading. I know that for me, reading is the chief source of zest, I think, in my life. One's work, if one likes what one does for a living. And also, I've had many good experiences teaching. Teaching also, again, has been another source of zest for me. Belief in a cause, doing volunteer work, music, cooking, all of these things can be causes of zest. What zest involves is concentrating on something and getting into the state of flow. By flow, psychologists mean a state in which we forget about time and forget about our problems because we're focused on something we enjoy. Russell's second chapter on happiness is entitled Affection. And he says that affection, by the way, can be an important cause of zest. He says loving others and being loved is a chief cause of happiness. And he says that the capacity to give affection to people is also an indication that one has escaped from the prison of self. Russell makes the point that self-centeredness so often gets in the way of happiness, and that when we can express affection for other people, we're getting our minds off ourselves. And the kind of affection he's talking about, by the way, goes beyond sexual romantic affection. He's talking about affection for other people in the way of brotherly love, for example. Russell also says that the family can be a source of happiness. Indeed, he says that parenting was the chief cause of happiness in his life. He says, though, that while the family can often be a cause of happiness, it's often a cause of unhappiness to either the parents or the children or both. And he says that one of the major reasons for this is the possessive impulse that parents may have, whereby they don't allow the child to develop his uniqueness, his individuality, and consequently the child rebels. Again, I must add that Russell, of course, believed that children and teenagers need discipline, but he also believed they need latitude for developing their individuality. Russell points out that parental affection is perhaps the most reliable kind of affection, that if one has mature parents, one may become very sick, one may become disgraced in some way, but if one has good parents, the source of their affection will be a very reliable one. And even though one's friends may desert oneself, even though one's lover may desert oneself, in a good family, parental affection will be a very reliable source of happiness. Russell also says that work can be a source of happiness. Early on in this chapter entitled Work, he raises the question, should work be considered a cause of happiness or unhappiness? And he says, in his opinion, it can be a cause of happiness. And one of the reasons he gives is this. Russell says that even the dullest work can be less painful than idleness. And why is that? Well, he says that to be able to fill leisure time intelligently is the last product of civilization, and at present very few people have reached this level. So that Russell believed that since so few people, and he wrote this book, by the way, in 1930, since so few of his contemporaries, he believed, were able to use leisure intelligently, that was another reason for categorizing work as a source of happiness. It's also interesting that Benjamin Franklin, in his autobiography, said he observed that, as a general rule, when people were working, they were happier than when they weren't. I'm confident that many of the people watching this program would challenge Benjamin Franklin's assessment. What are some of the other advantages that Russell enumerates concerning work? Well, he says that work can give a purpose to one's life. He also says that work can help to kill hatred and anger. How so? Well, he says work can kill anger and hatred because when one is working, one's mind can be focused. And indeed, work can help get one's mind off one's personal problems. He also says that work can be an important source of self-respect. And Russell says, and I'm quoting him, without self-respect, genuine happiness is scarcely possible. Russell points out in this chapter on work, by the way, that raising children is constructive work. What have some other famous thinkers said about the role of work in life? Freud thought that work was very important. Indeed, the two criteria Freud set up for determining whether someone was in good mental health were these. Freud said if someone has the ability to love and the ability to work, those are pretty good indications that someone is in reasonably good mental health. Tolstoy, the great Russian novelist, in Anna Karenina, said that to sleep well, one has to have done some work first. And to enjoy oneself, one also has to have done some work first. It is also interesting that many rich people today work. We know that Bill Gates, perhaps the most wealthy person in the world, still works. Mayor Bloomberg, the mayor of New York, still works. And it's interesting that the writer of the Harry Potter books, who supposedly, at least from what I've read recently, is the richest woman in the British Isles, she continues to write. And not only write, but to write rather long books, as you probably know. Goethe, the famous German writer, said that no blessing is equal to the blessings of work. And again, let me point out that Russell and others have said that work doesn't have to involve a job. There are many ways in life in which to work. And that another advantage of work is that it helps to put structure in our lives. Even if one disagrees with Russell on the merits of work, he does raise some important questions about leisure. For example, how does one spend one's leisure time? Is one spending one's leisure time in the most profitable way? Russell, like Aristotle, believed that one of the most profitable things we can do in our leisure time is to learn. Indeed, Aristotle said that all men by nature desire to know. All men by nature desire to know. And Aristotle believed that in order to fulfill our nature, in order to fulfill our human nature, we should be habitually engaged in learning something of significance. Russell does believe it's very important to have interests other than work. Indeed, he said we need a balance in life between work and leisure. He goes on to say that workaholics can lose perspective and that we need to refresh ourselves. Russell's last chapter on happiness is entitled Effort and Resignation. And in this chapter, he talks about the idea that to become happier requires effort. He said it's an achievement. It's not a gift of the gods. In other words, winning the lottery's not going to do it. It may help, but it's not going to accomplish what Russell would consider to be a more fulfilling life. And what are some of the things we must work at in order to achieve greater happiness? Well, Russell would say we must learn to cope with everyday problems. We must learn to control negative emotions. And of course, we want fulfilling relationships. And indeed, fulfilling relationships require effort. With regard to resignation, remember, Russell has entitled this last chapter, Effort and Resignation. Russell has said that in order to become happier, we must realize that we can't control many aspects of life. He said that resignation involves acknowledging that minor problems make up a very large part of life. Again, we must acknowledge that minor problems make up a very large part of life and that they're not going to go away. The Tao Te Ching is a famous Chinese book of wisdom, which also alludes to this theme. And in this Chinese book of wisdom, one of the main themes is that one should not try to force life to work in a way in which it won't. That's just a very frustrating way to live. And again, we must resign ourselves to certain aspects of life that perhaps we wish were not inevitable. Russell says this in concluding his chapter on effort and resignation, and I'm quoting him: "The attitude required is doing one's best while leaving the issue to fate." Again, the attitude required is doing one's best while leaving the issue to fate. Seneca was another very famous writer, a writer of antiquity, who talked about this idea of resignation. And Seneca said that one of the things we must disabuse ourselves of are dangerously optimistic notions about what the world and other people are like. Seneca believed that one of the chief causes of unhappiness in life and one of the chief sources of anger is that so often we human beings have dangerously optimistic notions about what other people and the world are like. And Seneca went on to say this, and this might be a tough pill for us to swallow, but here's what he said. Seneca said, "We will cease to be so angry when we cease to be so hopeful." Again, we will cease to be so angry when we cease to be so hopeful, excuse me. And one of the things he's talking about there are unrealistic expectations. I suspect that if you were to interview 10 psychiatrists at random, virtually all, if not all of them, would tell you that one of the chief causes of unhappiness in life is our unrealistic expectations. Russell's concluding chapter is entitled "The Happy Man." And in this chapter, Russell says that happiness depends partly upon external circumstances and partly on ourselves. And he says this book that he has just written tells us what we ourselves can do to become happier people, that it doesn't deal with external circumstances that might affect our happiness. But then again, he does conclude that external circumstances can play a role in the degree of happiness which we achieve. Russell, in summarizing, says the key to greater happiness is avoiding self-centeredness, avoiding self-absorption, getting our minds off ourselves, and also it involves cultivating affection and making learning an habitual part of our lives. Russell's concluding statement, I think, is a quite interesting one and provides a superb summary. Russell says, and I'm quoting him, "The good life is one inspired by love and guided by knowledge. Neither love without knowledge, nor knowledge without love can produce a good life." In past programs, I have hoped to conclude with some book recommendations concerning the themes that I had pursued in those programs, but generally speaking, I didn't have the time to do that. Well, today we do have some time to do this. So what I'd like to do now is to recommend some books that I myself have found helpful in trying to live a more fulfilling life, and maybe you will find them helpful too. These are books in philosophy, psychology, literature, and religion. I'm also aware, by the way, that some of you are very avid readers. I don't doubt that some of you have already read some, if not all, of the books I'll be recommending, whereas others among you perhaps either haven't had the time to read very much or the desire. And I will also try to recommend some books for that category of viewers. Before I do recommend some books, I want to point out that Harold Bloom, a professor at NYU and at Yale, has written a book entitled "How to Read and Why." How to Read and Why. And among the advantages he claims we can derive from reading are the following. He says, first of all, that reading is the most healing of pleasures. And he says that while reading is solitary, it still alleviates our loneliness. I have found that to be true. I can't ever recall reading and feeling lonely at the same time. He says also that reading can provide a replacement or supplement to friendship. Reading can provide a replacement or supplement to friendship, which he says is so vulnerable to diminish or disappear. And Professor Bloom says that one of the chief advantages of reading is that it can help us to know ourselves and others and to better understand life. Henry David Thoreau, on this subject of reading, in Walden, in a section of the book entitled Reading, Thoreau said that good books can tell us what our friends and relatives can't tell us or won't tell us. Thoreau also says that good books can help us to see beyond the transient to the enduring. Indeed, Thoreau said that our minds can be permanently profaned by habitually focusing on the trivial. How many people spend a good deal of their leisure time focusing on a program concerning a celebrity murder trial or political gossip or sports gossip? Well, Thoreau would say that good books can take us beyond that kind of thing and again help us to deal with the enduring in contrast to the transient, and therefore help us to live more fulfilling lives. Let me start off by recommending some easy-to-read self-help books. Again, easy-to-read self-help books. The first book I wish to recommend is a book entitled The Art of Happiness. The Art of Happiness, co-authored by the Dalai Lama and psychiatrist Howard Cutler, an American psychiatrist. Psychiatrist Cutler said that over the years he had noted some similarities between psychiatry and Buddhism, which very often is considered to be a rather hygienic religion. Not that all other religions aren't also hygienic. In any event, Cutler asked the Dalai Lama if he would cooperate with him in writing a book to try to explore the similarities between Buddhism and psychiatry. And I think this book does that very well. Again, it's called The Art of Happiness. Another book that I think is easy to read and provides some superb advice is a book that was on the New York Times bestseller list for more than 10 years. It holds the record for having been on the New York Times bestseller list the longest amount of time. It's called The Road Less Traveled. The Road Less Traveled by psychiatrist M. Scott Peck. The books I wish to recommend now fit into the category of introductory books in philosophy. Some of you perhaps have cultivated an interest in philosophy and might be wondering what might be some good books to read which will provide an overview, an introduction, and an overview to what so many of the great philosophers have taught. One of my recommendations is a book called The Story of Philosophy by Will Durant. Will Durant was a very famous historian, and this book, entitled The Story of Philosophy, was written many years ago, but has become a classic. This again provides a very good overview of some of the major philosophers and what they believed. Durant has a chapter on Aristotle, other chapters on Kant, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and Russell. Another book which I recently read, and it's a recent publication, very short book, which provides a good introduction to philosophy, is a book called The Consolations of Philosophy. The Consolations of Philosophy by Alain de Botton. Alain, A-L-A-I-N, de, D-E, Botton, B-O-T-T-O-N. And in this book, Botton talks about how philosophy can provide some consolation for us not having enough money or for having a broken heart, and other ways in which philosophy can provide some consolation for daily problems which we experience. Another book which I recently read, which again provides a terrific overview and survey of the history of philosophy, is a book also known as The Story of Philosophy. I mentioned Durant's book is called The Story of Philosophy. Well, this book is by Brian McGee. Again, it's called The Story of Philosophy by Brian McGee. His last name is spelled M-A-G-E-E. And this book provides some excellent explanations of some of the philosophies of the major philosophers. For those who are pretty well versed in philosophy and are looking for a very challenging book to read, which provides a survey and critique of the great philosophers, I highly recommend Bertrand Russell's book, A History of Western Philosophy. Again, A History of Western Philosophy by Bertrand Russell. I must warn you, the book is more than 800 pages long and has some rather sophisticated explanations of the work of the major philosophers and some extensive critiques. But again, if you have already some knowledge of the great philosophers and you want to deepen that knowledge and also look at them in a critical vein, this is the book to go to. Again, A History of Western Philosophy by Bertrand Russell. With regard to books by philosophers themselves, some short books that you might enjoy. The Apology by Plato. It's only about 150 pages, might even be less than that, by the way. The Apology by Plato, it tells you how a famous philosopher viewed society, people, and wisdom. Perhaps the most important line in this book is this: the unexamined life is not worth living. The unexamined life is not worth living. Two other very short books written by philosophers that are very helpful, I think, in leading us to more fulfilling lives are a book entitled Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, and Letters from a Stoic by Seneca. Also, a book by Nietzsche called Beyond Good and Evil. Beyond Good and Evil. It challenges conventional wisdom and also gets us to think more deeply about our values. And a fifth book in philosophy, a classic called The Republic by Plato. This is a book which deals with Plato's vision of the ideal society. What would education be like in the ideal society? What would the socioeconomic system be like? And what would be the attitude of society towards religion? Again, in a utopian society. The name of the book is The Republic by Plato. And finally, as usual, I'd like to remind us that we are all artists, in the words of Henry David Thoreau. To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts.